Hi guys, my name is Alicia, and if you didn't know, I sell used clothing on the apps Depop and Poshmark. Now, a while ago, I received this comment on one of my videos, and I've kind of been thinking about it ever since. So basically someone left a comment saying, no, don't sell on Depop. Thrifting items for $10 and selling them for so expensive is just so bad. Poor people can buy these for cheap and use these. And if more people thrift flip, then thrift shops will increase their prices, and some are doing it. I hate people like you. So I know that this comment is coming from a place of concern, and at first it may seem like this person's raising some good points, but the topic of reselling is extremely complicated, and it just can't be dismissed with a few sentences. So that's why I'm making an entire video about this topic. And this is just a tiny glimpse into the kind of criticism that resellers receive. This is actually the first negative comment I've ever received on it. So I wanted to address it directly and talk about all of the effects of reselling, both negative and positive. And before you leave a comment on this video, I'd really encourage you to watch the entire video just to understand all aspects of this topic and to see what I recommend resellers do to stay sustainable. So if you're unfamiliar with the term reselling, the Google definition is to sell something one has bought to someone else. And one of the most popular ways to resell at the moment is through thrifting. Now, this definitely isn't a new idea, but with the rise of sustainable fashion and apps like Depop and Poshmark, reselling has been more easy and accessible than ever, and almost anybody can do it. And even though I would consider myself a reseller, only about 10% of my inventory even comes from thrift stores, but we're gonna get into that a little bit more later. Okay, so the first part of this comment that we are going to unpack here is poor people can buy these for cheap and use these. So this is implying that if I purchase an item, I am taking it away from someone who could have used it. So this presents the idea that there are not enough clothing to supply everybody at a thrift store. And I know that there are very many different variables that affect this, including, where the store is located, how big the store is, like what time of year it is, but in general, especially here in Canada, there is always a surplus of clothing being donated to thrift stores. According to a report done by the CBC in 2018, Canadians on average purchase 70 new articles of clothing a year, and that contributes to the 12 million tons a year of textile waste dumped into North America's landfills. So it's pretty obvious that we here in Canada and many other countries have a problem with the overconsumption of clothing and tend to buy from fast fashion companies. If you're not familiar with the term fast fashion, it is basically referring to inexpensive clothing produced rapidly by mass market retailers in response to the latest trends. And because we go through clothes so quickly, a lot of them do usually end up being donated to thrift stores. So in that same report, a single thrift store sorting center just outside of Toronto said that they receive up to 90 tons of clothing per week, so much so that about 75% of all clothes being donated to thrift stores doesn't even end up selling. And if you don't know, what doesn't sell usually will end up in a landfill or shipped overseas, where also it will probably end up in a landfill. So the idea that there isn't enough clothing just doesn't hold up. Even in my own experiences, it's really obvious that there is a surplus of clothing being donated. So I was just driving, and I was driving past one of these donation bins that I'm sure everyone has seen, where you can donate your clothes. And more often than not, when I pass these, the clothes are overflowing. So as you can see here, there are 2 donation bins here. By the way, these are massive. And all of these clothes strewn out on the ground. And that just goes to show that those bins are filled to the brim. I decided to check out another one of these bins, and wow, there's one more bin here, and yet there's still more clothes on the outside of the bin. So I thought I'd check back in on these bins one more time. The last video I took was from Friday, and this is now the following Monday. So literally 3 days, a weekend has passed, and look how much stuff is back. It's almost worse than the last time, I think. There's so much stuff. There's so much stuff. Every time I see it, it honestly blows my mind that my city alone, in this area alone, that this is how much clothing is being given away on like more than a weekly basis just from these 2 bins alone. And just for full transparency, those clips were taken when my city was in full lockdown and thrift stores were closed. So I think those donation bins were getting a lot more donations than normal because people weren't able to donate directly to the thrift stores, but it still goes to show just how much clothing is being donated. And those 2 donation bins that I showed were only like a few kilometers apart. I think there was even another one along the way, which kind of puts things into perspective. So the idea that there's not enough clothing at the thrift store is just not true. Now, the second statement attached to this comment is, if more people thrift flip, by that they mean resell, then thrift shops will increase prices, and some are doing it. So basically this is the idea that if more people are shopping at thrift stores, prices will increase and low income people will no longer be able to afford clothing from thrift stores. So it is true, and it is a problem that thrift store prices have been rising over the last few years. And there are many possible factors why these prices have risen. The first thing that we can point to is inflation. So over time, everything becomes more expensive, Rent prices rise, minimum wage goes up. So those are just a few reasons why, thrift stores may have no choice but to raise prices. But I don't think this totally excuses the prices of thrift stores at the moment. I think with the rise of thrifting and sustainable fashion, thrift stores have taken advantage of that and raised their prices strictly to increase their profit margins. Just keep in mind too that at thrift stores, most of their clothing is given to them completely for free. They have to pay someone to sort through it and all that, but just keep in mind that everything they get is basically free. And if you didn't know, Value Village and Savers are kind of some of the biggest thrift stores across North America. And to be clear, they are a for-profit organization. They are not a charity. So if the issue is that thrift store prices are rising, I think we need to hold the actual thrift stores accountable for this and make sure that prices are going to be staying affordable. So I did some research, and according to Value Village's website, they are aware that, they are a source of clothing for lower income people. And it is true that their prices can be better than other stores. But nowhere on their website gives any sort of reassurance that these prices will not continue to rise. And especially with the pandemic and everything, they haven't done anything to, make it easier for people to access clothing. So I sent them an email regarding this issue to see if they could give me any insights on it, and they never responded. That was emailed to just like the general Value Village email. I also tried to contact Mark Walsh. He is the Chief Executive Officer of Value Village. I created a whole LinkedIn account just so I could message him on LinkedIn, and I haven't heard a response yet. And I think it's really interesting how people are so quick to blame resellers for the rising thrift store prices when they often forget about the large majority of just regular casual thrifters that go to the thrift store to thrift for fun and not out of necessity. Whether you're purchasing an item at a thrift store for yourself or with the intent to sell, you're still purchasing that item. What you do with it after doesn't have an effect on the fact that you already made that purchase. And yes, of course, resellers do typically buy more than the typical thrifter, but I think people are widely overestimating the amount of resellers versus just casual thrifters there to thrift for fun. So if you're gonna hold resellers accountable, I think you would need to also hold, everybody else accountable who's just thrifting for fun and not out of necessity. But I think pointing the blame at anyone except for the actual company is just super counterproductive. And I do think that resellers and just casual thrifters are an integral part of keeping these stores open. If all of a sudden all resellers and all casual thrifters stopped thrifting at thrift stores and it was only people who really, really needed to shop there, I'm not sure if a lot of thrift stores would be able to still stay open. So let's stop blaming resellers for the thrift store prices and start blaming the actual companies who control these prices. Because yes, as a reseller, I totally agree that thrift store prices should stay low, especially for low-income people who rely on the thrift store for clothing. And even if you didn't care about that, from strictly a reseller's business perspective, trust me, resellers don't want prices to rise either, because it starts to become really, really difficult to make a profit when the items you're purchasing are already $10 to $15 on average. Now, I wanted to address the final statement in that comment. The person said, thrifting items for $10 and selling them for so expensive is just so bad. So commenting on the price of a reseller's item is a super common criticism that I have come across many times, and I find it really interesting how they always bring it up alongside their other arguments, because those two things are completely unrelated. The price that I sell an item for has absolutely no effect on the fact that I already purchased that item and took it away from the thrift store. I personally think that sellers should be able to price their item however they want. If it's not something that you would pay for, you don't have to buy it. When you think of it, the value of an item at any store is completely what you make of it. For example, if you're shopping at Urban Outfitters, you see a pair of $80 jeans. You might think to yourself, like, hell no, I'm not paying $80 for these jeans. Like, that's way too overpriced. In that moment, you're deciding, this is not worth the value to me. Or on the other hand, you might see these jeans and be like, wow, like, this is a good pair of jeans. Like, I know I'm gonna wear these all the time. I'm gonna get my worth out of it. $80 is a fair price. Either way, you as the buyer have made a decision whether this item is worth the value to you. I guarantee you're not thinking about the fact that these jeans only cost like 2 cents to make. So that's why I just don't understand why people get so hung up on resellers' prices. If an item is overpriced, trust me, no one is gonna buy it. It happens to me all the time. Like, you cannot force someone to buy it. There's just some things that people don't want. Nobody wants it. But if someone does buy an expensive item on Depop, then that means that they thought that that was worth the value to them. And a lot of people have been bringing up the fact that, wow, Depop is so expensive now. You know, it used to be a place where people would just sell their own clothing, and now it's just like all expensive. You know, like, resellers have ruined the app. And that is just not true at all. There are so many clothes on Depop for so cheap. So cheap that I look at the prices and think, how is this person even going to make any money off of this item? There are so many accounts created every single day on Depop where people are just getting rid of their clothes and they're selling them for cheaper prices because they just want to get rid of them. So if you go to the search bar on Depop, type in jeans, for example, and then hit sort price low to high, or I think you can do like a price range. There are so many options of super cheap clothing on Depop. So it may seem like everything's so expensive on Depop because that's what Depop promotes. If you go to the explore page, you know, it's all the higher priced items because that's the image they want to give. And of course, think about it, the more money you sell your item for on Depop, the more money Depop is getting. So obviously that's the stuff that they actually are pushing and they want to sell because they're going to be making more money. But in reality, there is a huge range of prices on Depop that can fit almost anyone's budget. So in the comment that that person left me, they were specifically criticizing a sweater that I was selling for $30 plus $10 shipping because I bought it for like $3. So just to give you a little bit of perspective, if I end up shipping that sweater out to BC or Nova Scotia, for example, shipping's gonna cost me around $20. And then of course, Depop and PayPal take their fees, not to mention the fact that, you know, I had to photograph that item, I had to spend time looking for that item, had to pay gas to get to the thrift store, and then I have to actually ship that item. After all of those fees and all of those costs, I would only make about $12, which for some people is hardly even worth it. So I shouldn't have to explain my prices, but for anyone who has never sold anything before, hopefully that explains my pricing a little bit better. But I think the strangest part about that comment is the fact that I wasn't even shopping at a traditional thrift store. I was shopping at a pay by the pound type store, similar to the Goodwill bins or the Goodwill outlet. This is a type of store where they sell clothes in bulk and you pay by the pound rather than each item individually. And these clothes actually come directly from their neighboring thrift store. That's exactly what they told me when I was shopping there. So this means that all the clothes they're selling are clothes that were already trying to be sold at the thrift store, but no one bought them. If I didn't buy that sweater, it would have very well ended up in a landfill. So while we're at it, I did want to address many of the other misconceptions about reselling. So another common critique that I've seen many times is that resellers ruin the fun of thrifting because they take all of the good stuff at the thrift store and then there's nothing left for everyone else. So first of all, I think the idea of good is extremely subjective because everybody has a different style. You know, what you might think is cute may be ugly to someone else. And some people may say that, you know, full-time resellers have an advantage because they can go to the thrift store whenever they want. They can get up early. They can go right as the store opens. So I am not a full-time reseller. I am only a part-time reseller. I actually have a full-time job, so I cannot go to the thrift store whenever I want. And despite the fact that I am a reseller, I don't actually thrift that much in comparison. And I have found plenty of good stuff at the thrift store. I just think it's really weird to make this claim when, you know, Value Village is constantly putting new items out on the floor every day. There isn't really a right time to go to the thrift store. According to the Value Village website, they say they put about 10,000 items out on the floor every single day. So there's plenty to go around. And I think people often create this illusion in their minds that, you know, when they go to the thrift store and they don't find anything they like, they can just blame it on the resellers and be like, well, the resellers got here first and they took all the good stuff. And I, as a reseller, there have been many days where I have gone to the thrift store and walked out with nothing. So it happens to everyone. You're not always going to find something you like. And at the same time, I think it's really easy to look at someone's Depop page and see all the cool stuff they found and think like, wow, they must be so lucky that they found all of that stuff. But in reality, it probably took them multiple different thrift stores, many hours, and probably multiple weeks in between in order to find those items. Another common assumption about resellers is that, you know, most resellers are just rich kids. I've heard this a lot, and let me tell you, if you are rich, this is not the business that you want to go into. So I found this comment under a TikTok related to reselling, and it said that reselling curated vintage is what helped me pay off my student debt. It's not always just rich privileged kids selling. And someone else actually replied to that comment and said, exactly, if they're rich and privileged, they wouldn't bother with taking the time to resell clothes. It's kind of hard. I've tried and failed, LOL. And I could not agree more. For one, reselling is an extremely difficult business to scale. Since every single item you sell is unique, you don't really have much control over how much you can supply or the prices that it costs to acquire each item. It's all extremely inconsistent, which makes your sales very unpredictable. You know, you can't just sell a shirt and see, wow, okay, that sold pretty well, let me just print like 100 more. That's not possible. If you're talented and you work really hard on your reselling business, you can make a pretty decent living, but you are not going to get rich. If you are rich and you have the money, you would be so much better off investing that somewhere else that's going to be a lot less hands-on and give you a bigger return on your investment. In fact, reselling can actually be a really great business for low-income people. You don't need a lot of capital to start the business. In fact, you can argue that you don't need any money to start the business because, you know, most people have clothing already in their closets that they may be wanting to get rid of and they can sell. I also found this other comment on TikTok saying, as a previously low-income person, it's how I paid my bills when I wasn't going to make it. Another person said, I've had family members who relied on selling thrifted items to survive. So reselling is not an example of the rich taking advantage of the lower class. There's just not enough monetary motivation in order for that to happen. So now that I've addressed all of the negative arguments against reselling, I wanted to talk about the many good things and positives of reselling. So when you resell, you are promoting sustainable, secondhand fashion. And this actually makes secondhand clothing a lot more accessible. There's a lot of people who maybe you live in a small town and you don't have access to thrift stores. And some people just straight up don't like thrifting, but they still want to shop secondhand. By selling on Depop, you are making secondhand fashion more widely available. You are providing people the same thrill of an online shopping experience, but keeping it sustainable. This in turn will discourage people from buying from fast fashion companies, and in the long run will decrease the demand for the production of fast fashion clothing. And the reason we want to lower the demand of fast fashion is because of all of the harmful effects it has on both people and the environment. So the reason that fast fashion clothes are so cheap is because the people creating them are not making a livable wage. According to sustainyourstyle.org, garment workers are often working for long hours and in horrible conditions. You know, we've all heard of the thousands of people who have been killed over the years in factories that have collapsed. These people often work in unventilated areas, which is harmful to their health, and are usually subject to both physical and verbal abuse if they don't meet their targets each day. And in addition, a lot of these workers are children. And not only are the people being harmed, but so is the environment. According to worldbank.org, the garment industry is one of the most polluting in the world. It's responsible for 10% of all annual global carbon emissions, more than all international flights and maritime shipping combined. When I first heard that fact, I honestly couldn't believe it. When we're talking about global warming, we always think about, airplanes and all that. But it's really these factories that are producing the most amount of pollutants. Every year, 500,000 tons of plastic microfibers are dumped into the ocean. This is the equivalent of 50 billion plastic bottles. And around 20% of all wastewater worldwide comes from fabric dyeing and treatment. The wastewater is often dumped into rivers where both people and wildlife will experience the harmful effects. And this is the reality of fast fashion. And I want to make it very clear that I do not think you're a bad person if you buy fast fashion clothing. And I know that a lot of low-income people and plus-size people don't have any other options when they're shopping. I am guilty too. I occasionally buy a few clothes from Urban Outfitters a few times a year, but that is why Depop and resellers are an essential part in creating that shift towards shopping more sustainably. Additionally, I think that resellers can provide a lot of value that thrift stores can't. Many resellers are super crafty and like to upcycle or repair clothing that they find at thrift stores. A lot of the clothing that I actually received are very damaged and beyond repairable, and I always try my best to create something new from them. So for example, these Root sweatpants that I turned into both a bucket hat and used them to create this second pair of sweatpants. Stuff like that would just not stand a chance at the thrift store and would probably end up in a landfill. Depop sellers can also keep their inventory for much longer than thrift stores. Therefore, the clothes have a better chance of being sold and reused. Whereas the thrift store has to constantly be refreshing their clothing because of all the clothing they receive. Some of my clothing has sat in my inventory for upwards of a year. And once again, those clothes just wouldn't have stood a chance at the thrift store. So with all that being said, I do still think that resellers need to be mindful when sourcing their items. If you are sourcing your items from a thrift store, keep in mind where your money is actually going. Thrift stores like the Salvation Army and Goodwill are non-profit organizations, so by shopping at their stores, you are funding their charities. You can do your own research on this. I know Goodwill has been criticized for how they run their business, but I think it still may be better to shop at Goodwill than Value Village, because at Value Village, your money is not going to any charities. They are a for-profit organization, so this is something that even I have to remind myself of. I do mainly shop at Value Village, so I'm going to try to keep that in mind from now on. When sourcing your items from thrift stores, you also want to make sure that there is enough essential clothing items left. So for example, if you find a winter coat, just take a look at the rack and make sure you are leaving enough behind, in the same size and everything, so that if someone comes in the store who really needs a winter coat, they're going to be able to find that. And from my experience, this isn't usually a problem because there are so many clothes at the thrift store, but it's something that you should definitely keep in mind when you're shopping. Also, from what I've heard, plus size clothing can be extremely difficult to find at the thrift store. So if you're not in need of those items, leave them behind. If you are a plus size person, I would love to hear your thoughts on this. Do you think it's more important that plus size people have access to plus size clothing at the thrift stores or, on websites like Depop? I personally would think thrift stores, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Maybe there can be some sort of balance. I don't know. So if you're a reseller and you want to branch out where you source your items from, thrift stores are not the only place that you need to go. So like I said, only about 10% of all of my inventory I've ever listed has come from a thrift store. And from a business standpoint, I do think it's beneficial to diversify where you are sourcing your items from. So Goodwill outlets and these pay by the pound stores are really great options. They are way cheaper and they allow you to save clothes that, like I said, would probably otherwise have ended up in a landfill because they didn't sell at the thrift store. And I know that not everybody has access to these. I didn't for a long time until one like opened up near me, but if you do have access to them, they're a really good option. But my absolute favorite way to source clothing is for free. So I do get asked a lot, like, how do you get clothes for free? And it's pretty simple. Just like kind of put yourself out there, tell your friends, your families, your neighbors, like, hey, I am accepting clothes. This is what I do. This is why it's good for the environment. And I think you'll be surprised just how many clothes you'll receive, especially if they were just going to bring those clothes to a thrift store like Value Village anyways. Now, it's not the most convenient way to thrift. It's definitely a lot more work. You got to source through a lot of items. You may not even find anything that is worth selling, but it's a really good option that often gets overlooked. Now, lastly, I feel like it's really easy as a reseller to accumulate a lot of clothing that can't necessarily be sold online, and it's really convenient to just take these clothes and drop them off at the closest thrift store or donation bin that you can find. But I think we can be a little bit more thoughtful when we're donating our clothes. Now, I did a little bit of research on alternative ways to donate your clothing in Toronto, and I found some really cool organizations. So what I liked about these organizations in particular is that the clothing actually goes directly to people who need the clothes, rather than most organizations that sell the clothes and then put that money towards a charity. The first organization that I wanted to talk about is called Glow. They're basically like a free thrift store where, you know, people in need can go and have that typical shopping experience, except all the clothing is for free. I thought that was such a cool idea, and honestly just so important because so many of donated clothes don't actually go to people in need. The next organization that I found is called Dress for Success. This is similar to the last one, except they give women access to professional workwear clothing in order to help them find jobs and get interviews. This organization is really amazing as well, and personally, in my experience, it's very difficult to sell workwear and office wear online, so this is a really good place that I can take all of those clothes. And the last organization is called Dress Your Best. This is basically the men's version of the last one I talked about. They're actually located at the same address, so I have to assume that they are associated with each other, which is going to make it super convenient to donate to because I can just drop everything off at once. So from now on, all of the clothing I have that I can't sell will be donated to these 3 charities. And even if you don't live in the Toronto area, I would highly encourage you guys to do your own research to see if there's any similar options where you live. If there isn't, Facebook is a really good option. There's a lot of free pages on Facebook where people are giving things away, and you could definitely post into that Facebook group saying that you want the clothes to go to somebody in need. So that is everything I wanted to talk about in this video. Something I've been thinking about for a long time. I've actually been writing this video for a few months now, I would say. And I know this is a really complicated subject, so I would love to hear everybody's thoughts in the comments. I'm very open to hearing everyone's thoughts, but I want to make sure that the discussion stays productive. But anyways, thank you guys for watching, and I will see you next week.